Greetings, listeners. Welcome to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motions podcast. I am JJ Kimchi. Within both academic and religious circles today, we are frequently told that we live in a postmodern age. Postmodernism, as an ideological worldview, is often presented as a grave challenge to many of the concepts we hold to be at the center of our lives, including truth, history, and even religion itself. But what is the nature of the confrontation between postmodernism and the Jewish faith? Is it one of hostility, or can it be one of fruitful dialogue and engagement? And who are the major Jewish thinkers in recent decades who have engaged with this stream of ideas? With us to discuss this intriguing topic today is Dr. Miriam Feldmann-Kaye, one of the major scholars of this topic. Dr. Feldmann-Kaye is a lecturer in modern Jewish philosophy at Bar-Ilan University and an associate professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. She holds a BA from Cambridge University, and her PhD in Jewish thought is from the University of Haifa. She has written the major book on the subject so far, Jewish Theology for a Postmodern Age, published by the Littman Library of Jewish Civilization in 2019. And aside from all this, she holds the distinction of being our very first British guest here on the podcast of Jewish Ideas, and I'm very excited to discuss these points today with her, with a fellow Brit. Dr. Feldmann-Kaye, welcome to the podcast of Jewish Ideas.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Excellent. It's wonderful to have you. So let's dive right in. We hear quite a lot about postmodernism, especially within academic circles, and the effects that it may or may not be having around the world. But before we jump into such a discussion, we should probably arrive at a definition of postmodernism, or at least a description of it, especially because whenever I engage in similar conversations with people, we usually bog down in this. They turn to me and say, well, what is postmodernism? And then I try and define it, and they say, well, that's not really postmodernism. And then the conversation goes awry from there. So before we go into the questions of an engagement and confrontation with Judaism, perhaps you could give us a few minutes of description. What is, for the purposes of this conversation, how can we describe postmodernism?
Okay. You added in some very important caveats, which will help us to answer the question, such as, for the purposes of this conversation, which already allows us to narrow it down a bit. But in all seriousness, actually, the way we define postmodernism changes the way we approach the subject. And actually, I want to give a broader frame before I kind of explain some of the content. Is that one of the I think the best ways it has been a kind of framing of it has been recently by the recently deceased Professor Shalom Rosenberg of the Hebrew University, and I bring him into at the beginning, firstly kind of in his memory, but also because he was an ardent objector to postmodernism, as we see with many of the great scholars. But in any case, he wrote a fascinating article giving a Jewish perspective on postmodernism. And he begins with a framing, which says that the meeting point between postmodernism and Jewish thought should be seen as either a sicha, a conversation, or imut, which is like a conflict or a discord. And he says that it is for most people, it presents some kind of imut, some kind of conflict. And I would say that actually, we need to frame this more as a sicha than we do as imut, if we are to come to terms with it and to grapple with it.
Which is for this reason I brought you on here. This is an excellent setting for such a sikha.
Great. So firstly, it's when you talk about when I mean kind of coming away from the imut, or the point of discord, it's in a way saying, let's recognize an important change that's going on. This isn't a change that's been going on since the year 2000. There's not necessarily it doesn't necessarily have a start date or an end date. In terms of content, I'll just bring some of the main ideas that I think perhaps many people are familiar with. but I'm going to try and phrase them in the way that will allow us to kind of bring in the discussion of Jewish responses to this ideas. Okay, we have the main idea of the breakdown of the meta-narrative. Okay, the idea of the breakdown of the meta-narrative comes through certain continental, often French, philosophers, theoreticians, linguistic scholars, semioticians, who essentially redefine the idea of truth as narrative. Okay, any large idea that has been held, which, as you say, it can be history itself, it can be the discipline of philosophy itself. Any kind of large story that we buy into is called a grand narrative. I have a student who once called it a mega narrative, which I liked, because normally it's known as a meta narrative, but really a mega narrative, or a mega story. Okay, which can be, again, history. It can be a discipline in and of itself. These must be broken down, deconstructed, according to the jargon, into a multitude of necessarily differing, often in the extremity, smaller narratives, local narratives. And this is something that is called for. It's not kind of something that has happened or should happen. It's something that we need to, we're all called upon to bring about. Okay, so if we have been taught or educated or learned some kind of ground narrative, the idea or the postmodern call is to break that down. Okay, and how does one break that down? That's done through another of the main ideas, which is to view the meta narrative and perhaps the entire way we see things and our entire worlds of ideas as cultural and social constructs. Okay, so perhaps things that we believe in, even things that we hold dear, are actually not perhaps things that truly exist or that we truly value, but rather they are things we have either been forced, according to somebody like a thinker such as Michel Foucault, to accept, or kind of educated into certain ideas through a culture, through a particular social system. It's quite a cynical way of, I think, looking at the idea of education as well, how we kind of learn these meta narratives, and then we're stuck within them, so to speak. And the idea that another part of this call is to recognize that those ideas or values that we hold dear are cultural and social constructs.
Right. As I remember being taught it, it's associated with a profound counter-Enlightenment thrust, as it were. In other words, to undermine many of the certainties that came about during the Age of Enlightenment, certainties about truth and about what human beings are and what history is and what truths of religion or whatever it is. And this is postmodernism is a thrust against that, in a way of undermining things which had seemed so certain to thinkers of the West, and ought to be questioned and called into doubt, essentially.
Exactly, and that there are two, even kind of on a more, I suppose, semantic level. There's this kind of very famous article by Immanuel Kant, written in Enlightenment times, called Was ist Aufklärung? What is the nature of the Enlightenment, right? Where he calls, as we know, and then we have a kind of this a mirror essay by Michel Foucault in Postmodern Times, also called What is Enlightenment? Mirroring or shadowing Immanuel Kant, and there we have a kind of redefinition of enlightenment, or critique of enlightenment as progress, critique of enlightenment meta narratives as a reason, and perhaps the things that we have come to hold dear. And the idea then is is to disrupt that and dislocate that grand narrative.
Right, which is precisely why a conversation like this is always a little slippery, because we talk of postmodernism as though it's an ism, like many other isms, which, communism or socialism, whatever it is, that can be defined and can be spoken about in a coherent manner. Whereas it seems the whole point of postmodernism is to undermine speaking about things, entities in a specifically coherent manner, which it makes conversations like this somewhat more difficult. And it leads me to the second question, which is, so we have forms of Judaism nowadays, or streams within Judaism that have sought to either ally themselves with or integrate themselves into postmodernism. And it kind of, and I want to ask here, does this belong on the continuum of Jewish philosophical development? Right. In other words, can you say, we had medieval Jewish rationalism, and we had, Chassidut, and we've had Jewish Enlightenment thinking, and now we have postmodern inclined Judaism, or something like that. Is it something that belongs on this continuum, or is it something actually quite different? Is it something that isn't, in fact, part of the same game as has been played in previous centuries?
Mm-hmm. Great. So this is a very important question, because you're asking also beyond the topic. You're asking about the method of, if we're going to talk about this, should we also then internalize the postmodern call to break down the very discipline that we're talking about? So I would say no at this juncture, because it would be, I think it would be quite kind of destabilizing in a sense at the outset to say, we've come to the end of Jewish philosophy. I would say, we shouldn't do that. What we do need to do is to take a broader look at the situation around us, because really, in contemporary Jewish thought, I want to kind of locate postmodernism as one of the main ideas in late modern and contemporary Jewish thought. Okay, so the idea of continuum, like you say, plays an important part here, because really we're talking about development of different schools of thought. But it would be a mistake to speak of postmodernism as the kind of the ultimate issue, or the only issue currently permeating Jewish thought. And I think if we look at the last few decades, essentially we need to look at four main movements. My book concentrated on one of them, which was postmodernism, and since then I've been dedicating time also to these other three. And these three are, firstly, the phenomenological movement. It's thinkers we perhaps associate an idea that we perhaps associate with philosophers such as Edmund Husserl. We speak about the phenomenon, the perceived transcendence from the inside. We think about how religious symbols function. We understand holiness, religious belief from our own perspective. Now, the phenomenological movement has seen kind of certain developments in Jewish thought. I think perhaps most famously at the moment through Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel's phenomenological stance. And then the second school of thought is the philosophy of dialogue, or dialogical philosophy. Now, most people are familiar with the ideas of thinkers such as Franz Rosenzweig, Martin Buber, Emmanuel Levinas. As far as one can kind of draw a category, what we're ultimately talking about is a critique of existentialism, which had the one, the individual or the subject at the center. And the dialogical thought of these thinkers posits otherness in the place where perhaps prior to them we had been preoccupied with talking about the individual, their mind.
I just wanted to interrupt and say, when you say most people are familiar with Levinas and Rosenzweig, I think you mean most people who we interact with professionally. Oh, they're familiar with the names. Yes.
Names.
Okay, fine.
Yeah,
I'll accept that. I don't know who's living in your neighborhood. I can't imagine most people in mine are settling down with Rosenzweig, Star of Redemption at night for a cozy read. Sorry to interrupt. I just had to posit that caveat there. Go ahead.
No, I think you're right. I think though, you are touching on something important, because the names are well known, and they're well known in the field of modern Jewish thought, or perhaps even in Jewish thought in total. I think because of the influence they're having and that they've had, and because they've kind of pivoted away from the type of focus on the subject, which we saw partially. Some of the ideas stem from René Descartes' idea of the mind. There we learned about the independence of the mind. With Kant, we learnt about human agency, again talking about the individual. Earlier, from Baruch Spinoza, we learnt about the faculty of rational inquiry, and when all of this very important Enlightenment thought, we're seeing that the development of the subject. Okay, and then really the beginning of here the semantic of the kind of late modern, postmodern. We have the dialogical philosophy, which is part of it's a type of existentialism, but it's also really an inner critique of existentialism, saying that we will self-destruct if we go down this path. That's the second one. The third one is hermeneutics. Okay. Hermeneutics is when I say hermeneutics, I mean really the act of interpretation. And this is not new. Okay, so we're in Jewish thought, in Jewish life, in Jewish practice, a lot of what we do is hermeneutics. A lot of the way we live is based on acts of interpretation in halachic discourses and far beyond. But the idea of hermeneutics as philosophy, or the idea of hermeneutics from a philosophical perspective, is something that is new. Okay, so if you want, we can talk about that a bit later. But this is just really to point to those four main ideas in contemporary Jewish thought: the phenomenological, the dialogical, the hermeneutics, and then the postmodern philosophy. So it's important to locate it there.
And presumably the four are intertwined, meaning these are not four isolated streams of thought. These are four which deeply interact and enrich each other, presumably.
Yeah, sure.
So really what you're saying is we need to invite you back for 3 more episodes after this one, and one on each of these. Okay, so I want to ask you, Dr. Feldman-Kay, the following, especially as one British person speaking to another, which is that what about those who are generally quite skeptical of postmodernism or the postmodernist critique in general? I say this especially as there was a famous letter written in 1992 by a group of Cambridge academics when the University of Cambridge was supposed to honor Jacques Derrida with an honorary doctorate, and they wrote a furious letter in the Times saying that this man, his writings hold none of the conventions of philosophy, and as far as we can tell, he's not saying anything of importance or even coherence at all, and therefore we cannot, in good conscience, offer him a doctorate of philosophy. And this speaks to the phenomenon that many, certainly in the Anglo-American world, are very skeptical at best of postmodern ideas and writings. And so I want to ask the question, so what about those who are of this intellectual persuasion? Even for those, is this still an important field of inquiry? And should they still consider this, especially when considering the interaction with Judaism and Jewish ideas? How does that play out for those who aren't postmodernists in their orientation?
Okay. Firstly, it's funny that you mentioned that letter, because quite a few years later, I was studying theology in Cambridge, and Derrida was a huge part of the syllabus.
Oh, how the mighty have fallen! Yes.
So So, but actually that's the beginning parts of really how can theology engage in Derrida, and that's also an issue that comes up in the anthropology of religion as well. So I think there's just something very important to say about this, that firstly, nobody is out to persuade anyone that postmodernism is the truth. Okay. However, there are many people who it tends to be people of a younger generation who are already living in a postmodern world intellectually. They are living out a postmodern world in terms of their practice and their private lives. The idea of the singular narrative and perhaps being the sense of being perhaps cut off from a grand sense of meaning should be taken very seriously on a theological level and also on an educational level. I think that definitely some of the ideas of postmodernism are questionable and even objectionable. But if you're already living and thinking in that space and you are already affected by it, it doesn't help for somebody in the world of Jewish thought and Jewish life to say postmodernism is wrong, we must reject it. What we're looking for is really we're looking for like-minded people who perhaps are familiar with the ideas, who have engaged with them, who can understand where some of the main concepts of Jewish life and Jewish thought are set to be, in some cases, enriched, in most cases, perhaps undermined, if we don't kind of deal with this properly. And for those people really to be able to respond to the deep Jewish postmodern critique that's developing. And from what I can tell, from what I've seen and from what I've heard, the Jewish engagement with postmodern intellectual thought for these people is nothing short of a lifeline. Okay, now there are in a sense, this objection to the postmodern turn, it has formed such a great obstacle to actually even kind of getting off the ground with the discipline. This is truer of contemporary Israeli Jewish thought than I think it is of diaspora Jewish thought. Where postmodern Jewish intellectual movements are in their 20th year, notably those of textual reasoning, constructive Jewish theology movements that I'm part of. I think the path of Jewish thought in Israel is different because the religious ideas go hand in hand with the Zionist ideas, and any kind of changes there really affects entire ideologies, and so things kind of have a different take a different pace.
Right. Okay, fantastic. So now I want to I don't know if this is a pushback slightly or a complication to what you say, but it seems to me that actually for a lot of religious Jews nowadays, postmodernism is quite damaging, or is at least a challenge, precisely because we're all students in one degree or another of Maimonides. In other words, Maimonides specifically, actually Saadia gone before him, but Maimonides, especially in the medieval period, left us with this idea that Judaism is in fact founded on theological axioms, certain principles of theology or philosophy that upon which the entire religion rides or dies. So, the unity of God, the incorporeality of God, Torah min hashamayim, things like that. And it seems to me that a Judaism based on, let's say, immovable ideas like this, or non-negotiable ideas, is far more is far more vulnerable, let's say, to the postmodernist critique, rather than those who view their Judaism or Jewishness as, let's say, a culture or a civilization, or even a praxis-based a religion. And therefore, I want to ask, do you think that it is particularly acute for those who base their religion on a specific theology, or have I somewhat misdiagnosed it?
Okay, so I'm going to break the question down into two parts. The first part is about the undermining of Jewish thought. The way I see it, the movements of biblical criticism and scientific critique of Judaism have wrought far greater havoc on Jewish belief than postmodernism is set to do. I see the results of and continued results of scientific critique of Bible as having kind of such a huge impact on Jewish thought and on Jewish belief, in a way that I know for many in my generation really quite simply sent people away. The second movement that has pushed a lot of people away in my generation has been the feminist revolution. I know that there's many in my generation who kind of, upon encountering the feminist movement together in a kind of, so-called world where it was to sit comfortably with traditional Jewish life and thought. In the end, the feminist ideas won out, and a lot of people in my generation who I grew up with and studied with, women who saw no path being made for them, simply left. So those are really two movements that have biblical criticism and feminism who have kind of pushed people away. I can't say of feminism, and I also can't say of biblical criticism that thinkers haven't, stood up and said, okay, we need to deal with this, because there have been, and we can see
not satisfactorily enough in my mind, actually. Especially the biblical criticism. I think that despite the best efforts of your colleague Joshua Berman at Bar-Ilan and one or two others, it remains, to my mind, still quite in need of thorough treatment. But anyway, that's just my personal opinion.
No, that's a very important personal opinion. We can talk about that as well. I'm happy to talk about that as well. So look, I think when we sit here and we think about biblical criticism, thinkers standing up to our satisfaction or not, facing the problems, they have to understand the ideas at the root of biblical criticism. Okay. If thinkers are going to come and integrate feminism into Jewish thought, they have to have some or a deep knowledge of not only the feminist movement but the implications for it. Okay, so we arrive at the idea of postmodernism, and I think we're not sure yet what the kind of the impacts. The impact of it is, partially that's the sociological question anyway. But I do see that some of the main ideas of postmodernism are issues that we are all dealing with anyway, and perhaps we're less aware of it. But ideas of my idea being relative to yours, so on. Those are ideas that we're dealing with. Okay, I think when we give it a name and we make it far more extreme, and we say that the ramifications, can turn everything that we thought to be right or true into just another mere narrative, I think that's it's scaremongering in a sense. Okay, I think we can kind of rephrase it and say that the world we are living in today is asking of us to view our values and opinions and thoughts in a certain way. If we believe we can truly reject that world, then it's our prerogative. But if there are so many people for whom that is already their world, we need brave people to stand up, to dive into those worlds of ideas and to begin to respond.
100%. I fully agree with you. It's again, I guess it's more of a sociological observation. It seems to me that there are enough Jews for whom, let's say, a theological certainty of some kind, or a list of some kind, will be important enough to them that the moment you say to them something like, there is a stream of ideas called postmodernism which calls all certainties or all narratives or all positive truth statements into question, they would be, I would say, either extremely nervous, or they'd say, how can you base any kind of religious system on ideas which you admit are fragile or vulnerable? You have to have some axioms, some certainties. Is there, is the response, okay, we're not in the medieval period anymore, we just can't deal with it?
So I'm pleased you're bringing me back to the medieval period, because I wanted to answer your question about Maimonides as well. So I think that I would propose we kind of look at it differently. Because I think also the modern period has required that we give up certain elements of the idea of dogma in Jewish thought. And I was just talking with my students today, actually, about the teleological categories in medieval Jewish thought. Okay, and there are categories that we simply don't talk about anymore, in my view. Okay, right? Do you know which ones reward and punishment, perhaps a little bit in terms of post-Holocaust theology, but not head-on, not in a subject in and of itself. We don't talk about redemption anymore. Yes, Rosenzweig brought it a little bit back into the discussion, but it's not a kind of theological category that we're dealing with. Are we thinking about resurrection? Are we thinking about reincarnation? So, the idea, the realm of rationalist thinking really kind of shaved off these areas of difficulty, so that certain ideas, certain theological ideas would kind of continue to sit well with us. And it's been problematic enough to define revelation in modern times without having these additional categories, so that when we come to the postmodern period, we can say, well, it's not that everything is now being ruled out because it's a kind of a theological category in and of itself, but rather we need to look at how we can approach those categories and give them new life. And when I say that, I am actually talking about the resurrection of the dead, right?
Right, in a way, or resurrection of the long sleeping, anyway.
Resurrecting certain ideas that were there, that really have kind of gone on, because we can't, so does it mean that with postmodernism there will be ideas that will be very difficult to talk about? Yes, it does.
That's a perfectly fair answer. The truth is, I mean, having asked the question I immediately had my own pushback in my own mind, because, of course, one of the great difficulties of students of Jewish philosophy nowadays reading texts from the philosophical period is the sheer amount of certainty you find among thinkers like Rambam and Saadia and the rationalists of the Jewish tradition, because in their minds, if you just do philosophy correctly and well, you will inevitably reach certain conclusions. You cannot not reach certain conclusions if you maintain your logic and maintain a sound mind, which, of course, nowadays, I think a lot of philosophically inclined people would say, no, that's not how philosophy works, it's not how thinking works, and perfectly rational people can arrive at wildly divergent conclusions on all sorts of issues, especially things like metaphysics. So yeah, I mean, the sort of the difference between a modern student and a medieval student, just in terms of the place of certainty itself, would be, presumably quite, the gulf would be significant, I think.
Yeah, and I also think, the ways in which a contemporary student is looking at Maimonides are some of those ways are through postmodern methodological inquiries. We're seeing a kind of some really interesting creative Jewish theology, bringing together Maimonides with thinkers such as Levinas. There's 2 or 3 scholars looking at that now. So kind of how do we read Maimonides from the dialogical, hermeneutical perspective of Levinas, right? So which, this is a kind of perhaps, resurrecting certain of those theological categories, but in language that speaks to us, and that language, that we can work with, right? So that, the task of the student, that student is living today, that student is writing today. It needs to make sense to them.
Okay, so I would like to pose the following question, which is based on, admittedly, my own years of studying in yeshiva and yeshiva-like environments, studying texts like the Talmud and the Midrash and other such texts, which is, it strikes me, especially as I read some postmodern thinkers, that actually in some ways the Jewish tradition is perhaps uniquely conducive to a postmodern intellectual environment, seeing that the Talmud and the Midrash are actually forms of discourse that are based on multiplicity, multivocality, a kind of immense creativity with texts that takes away almost the power of the author of the biblical text and puts it very much in the hands of its interpreters, right? Which is a characteristic postmodern move, right? You say that texts are very much in the hands, or meaning of the text is deferred to those who read it, to those who interpret it. They have a strong role in building the meaning, creating the meaning inherent within those texts. And interestingly enough, I mean, that's a lot of the activity in Talmudic and Midrashic and the Jewish interpretive tradition. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on this? That, perhaps far from a challenge in some ways in this particular field, postmodernism can be somewhat conducive or can be harmonized well with the Jewish textual tradition.
Well, I think actually the question you've asked is an excellent example of a postmodern Jewish question, because inherent in your question of the role of Talmud, you're already kind of bringing in your knowledge of how postmodernist theories work and how they can then enhance the value that's given to text and interpretation, to parshanut in Jewish tradition. So I would only, yes, you're right. I would only add to that, that the idea of parshanut, of interpretation, is an inherent value in Jewish thought. So in terms of other religions, I think we're kind of working within a system that, as you say, is conducive to the textuality, to the hermeneutical emphasis that postmodernism places on thinking, and also the idea of interpretation as a method, the idea of discussion. Okay, which of course, as we know that lots of pages of Talmud and Midrash wouldn't cancel out, the common idea that they're talking about, and discussion on, a particular idea in Jewish theology doesn't cancel out a core value for what that thing is or should represent, but rather it allows for skills to develop, and the hermeneutical idea is one of them, and Derrida is one of the great proponents of this, and he actually talks about this method as emblematic of his broken Jewish identity or complex Jewish identity. But actually that ability to read different things into the same text, or to read differently textually, and to have different experiences of the text and interpretation, actually represents something of the nature of Jewishness. Another idea that we have that is inherent, kind of, that you know in your words might also be conducive, is that of mysticism. I know you wanted to move on to that later, but that's also kind of used according to some postmodern thinkers, and it lends itself naturally to the kind of discourse that's developing.
Interesting. So firstly, that's fascinating. We'll get onto the mysticism point very soon. I did want to go there. You're right, and I wanted to ask. So the downside, of course, of this observation or question that I posed is that, okay, so if great power is invested in the hands of the interpreter, if the sort of midrashic ethos, which is, I suppose, in a way conducive to postmodern turn within ideas. So where does that leave the original text, right? Because it's one thing for a postmodernist to turn around and say, hey, listen, we can read, let's say, Shakespeare or Plato in a postmodern fashion or a deconstructive fashion, and read it, so to speak, against its grain. But of course, for Jews reading, let's say, the Torah, reading the Tanakh, that poses difficulties. So where does that leave? If what I said before, if we're taking that before as read, so where does that leave authoritative Jewish text that at least traditional religion sees as divinely written or divinely inspired or whatever it is? Where does that leave the Tanakh? Where does that leave the great authoritative Jewish texts?
Okay, brilliant question. So this idea of endless interpretation is one of the ideas in the hermeneutical strand, of course, the postmodern. I believe that a Jewish philosophy of Tanakh today lends itself better to using the philosophical tools of phenomenology and dialogical thought. Why is this? Because with the ideas that have kind of come into the field from biblical criticism, that continue to come in from the field, the Tanakh for many has become historicized in a sense.
Okay.
And this is where another one of the kind of the major ideas in contemporary philosophy needs to be kind of utilized here, which is the phenomenological view, understanding of the function of the text. And this also kind of relates back very much into the postmodern idea, that when the Tanakh is used, and the way it is perceived is beyond that of a historical document. It has a self-perceived, transcendental, phenomenological life. Some of these philosophers talk about the idea of the life of the text. We know this even on a kind of even a day-to-day level by the ways the Tanakh is used physically, even. The ways Megillot are read, for example, in particular Chagim, different times of year, and these uses, a look at Tanakh as phenomenon or as an idea, allows us to view it as a happening, which is how it would be called in Hebrew, a hitrachashut. Something that is continually happening or continually existing, rather than chronology or history or merely text. We can also use the tools of dialogical philosophy to analyze the Tanakh afresh, And this is also what some of the dialogical philosophers have done. And some of us may be more familiar with thinkers such as Levinas, who uses the idea of hermeneutics, together with the ethical imperative in the latter half of the 20th century to really call us as readers to say that we have to be in dialogue with this text, and that any interpretation we give of this text must be done from an ethical perspective. So for this gives a new life of the text, which isn't kind of destroyed according to a grand narrative, but it does function as a phenomenon, and it functions according to the principles of dialogical philosophy. These ideas are very deep and very grand, and all of this requires a lot more time. But it is also important for me just to kind of put these ideas out there.
Okay, so now this has been fascinating, and your book on the subject you published a couple of years ago, which I, by the way, highly recommend. It explored the confrontation or discussion or encounter between Judaism and postmodernism through the exploration of two thinkers who have addressed the subject. One is Professor Tamar Ross, who is still a professor of philosophy at Bar-Ilan, and another is Rabbi Shimon Gershon Rosenberg, known colloquially as Rav Shagar, who was a Rosh Yeshiva of a religious Zionist yeshiva, and both of them have written works, in which they have addressed to some degree or another this Judaism and postmodernism confrontation. What I noticed interestingly about those two thinkers was that both of them seem to have been very nourished, although the ideas have been nourished rather, from Hasidic texts and ideas. Kabbalistic ideas, Hasidic ideas, they seem to feature very frequently in their books and in their responses to postmodernism. And I wanted to just pose the question as to why is this the case? Now, what is it about Kabbalistic or Hasidic ideas that seem to be conducive or seem to be relevant to a discussion of this kind? Why do they stand as a basis for this sort of exploration?
Okay, so what we know, firstly, about Professor Tamar Ross is that she has really dared to reconfigure Jewish mysticism in light of postmodern philosophies of language. Okay, so she would take a kind of, I suppose, earlier guises of the philosophy of language of Wittgenstein, and then kind of throws this onto Jewish mysticism. How does this, relate to the idea that the emphasis of mysticism, which you kind of rightly diagnose, should we say, in Jewish postmodern thinking? It offers a compelling world for her, because you have the idea of ontological, theosophical worlds through mysticism, where we're talking about, creativity and interpretation, but through, the richest, deepest sources that also speak to ideas of enriching the personal self. Rav Shagar engaged with a breadth of modern and postmodern ideas, responding to various philosophical issues. One of them was the New Age. Often you get inverted commas around the New Age. I'm not talking specifically about Rav Shagar and Tamar Ross, but he, one example of this is that he saw some of his yeshiva students who were who had perhaps gone on their post-army trips to the east, who were coming back, and who claimed that they had found spirituality in the East. Okay, now this is also perhaps one of those examples that we spoke about educationally. You could say, what could you say? No, spirituality is only in the Jewish faith. What did he say? He decided to open up the issue, the postmodernist issue of the New Age, and he turned to Eastern spirituality. And he sought out meeting points between Eastern spirituality and Chassidut. And kind of through this really redefine certain ideas that are very, prominent in the Jewish postmodern mind, such as the ideas of differentiating the particular from the universal. Ideas of how one justifies one's position in the face of somebody else's position in a relativistic age. How one talks about identity, an issue that's often lacking. And so for him also the ideas of mysticism are fundamental to him. And both of them actually discuss in different ways how far it is necessary to kind of lean on mysticism in a way for this to continue. I think it is at the root of it, and I think it's kind of come the ages have in a sense kind of merged together in such a way that as the academic and intellectual study of mysticism has come to light, and that now we have the study of Chassidut in Western universities, in tandem with that, mysticism as a whole has become popularized, and so these worlds are kind of working together. And there's very much a kind of a call, a need for that, for certain reasons that the sociologists study, but also from the kind of inherent phenomenological ideas of Jewish life and faith. They do very much lend themselves towards kind of building a new type of Jewish life and a new type of Jewish consciousness.
Interesting. Okay, another thinker who I would like to broach briefly is one that you have had considerable experience with and contact with, and someone who actually I also had contact with earlier in my life, which is the late Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. What's interesting to me is that Rabbi Jonathan Sacks was a keen critic of the Enlightenment. He very frequently in his works outlined a sharp criticism of what he considered to be Enlightenment ideas or values, and certainly the certainties of the Enlightenment. And he really saw that as a movement which in some ways led humanity down the terrible road it would eventually go down in the 20th century and towards the violence and destabilization of society, etc. Yet Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, as so far as I have read in his works, did not turn towards postmodernism. He actually he didn't really engage with that worldview, which is a little bit curious to me, because if you're going to criticize the Enlightenment to that extent, it's curious. And he certainly seems to me to have read at least reasonably widely among postmodern writers. He didn't really engage in that. That wasn't something he was interested in, and I'm curious as to why you think that is. I mean, you've lectured and written on Sacks's thoughts. What do you think was his position towards that? And maybe, I mean, again, to loop back to what I was saying at the beginning, was it just his Cambridge Englishness that rejected this kind of, French incoherent nonsense? Or was it actually, did it come from, I mean, I presume it came from something perhaps a little bit more intellectually serious than just an instinctive rejection?
Okay, so there's a lot to say, and I'm going to just try to...
Feel free to say as much as you think appropriate on this topic. Yeah, it's a big topic.
So, Rabbi Sacks was one of the greatest Jewish thinkers of our times. But when we think about, perhaps the topics we've discussed until now, it's not clear kind of where to place his thought. What we can already say, we'll link this back to the previous question, that postmodern Judaism that's developing in the diaspora is not dependent on mysticism as the kind of postmodern Judaism that's developing in Israel. And Rabbi Sacks too was wary of building a system of Jewish thought that had kind of mysticism ingrained within it. Sure, he was a valued Hasidut greatly. That, needless to say, all of these things, but he was certainly wary of mysticism making up a core component of how we explore our beliefs and make our judgments in the realm of Jewish thought. He had also kind of understood aspects of the world and of Western society differently. So one of the issues that bothered him most was religious extremism. Now, Rav Shagar, while he does talk about moderate nationalism, and there are other examples, but he's addressing quite a different issue in that way. So what we find with Rabbi Sacks is that his diagnosis, I suppose, of the postmodern situation is different, perhaps, to the thinkers we've discussed so far. What he was also very wary of was the problem of relativism. He believed that pluralism was a kind of a surefire collapse into relativism. He also, in quite differently to Rav Shagar, had no time for Foucault and Derrida and thinkers like this. He is once quoted to have said, "We have an ethical obligation to be clear." And this was the type or the style of writing of the continental, often French philosophers, is verbose, it's complex, and if you wanted to talk about the kind of Britishisms and different ways of thinking in that regard, you could bring that into it. But he had different things that he wanted to respond to him. So yes, he didn't kind of he's not a postmodern thinker in that way. He was also, it's important for me to say as well, he communicated to me that isn't kind of how he should be defined in terms of what he's doing. And I do think that the term modern Jewish thinker is much more apt for Rabbi Sacks, because he's really kind of spanning a great time frame. So while we won't term Rabbi Sacks a postmodern Jewish thinker, he was certainly one of the greatest Jewish thinkers who was responding to the postmodern age.
Interesting. I just to add to that, I think you're 100% right. This entered my mind as I was reading his last book, which is called Morality, because it seems that Rabbi Sacks, despite everything, does have a certain fundamental optimism about humanity. In other words, that book just shows that he was committed to certain, I would say, fundamental liberal values. Let's say freedom of speech, a certain kind of universal moral instinct that was not unerring, but at least valid and there. The marketplace of ideas and the at least a general orientation towards rationality and towards human goodness and reason and things like that, which I suppose aren't present in to be a postmodernist. You have to really believe that all those instincts are maybe flawed or can or should be undermined. That seemed to me to be at least be an element of Rabbi Sacks's discord, shall we say, with postmodernism, which, as you say correctly, he shouldn't be categorized as a postmodern thinker.
I think we could then return to Shalom Rosenberg's model of the kind of that frame of sikha. Is this a discussion or is this imut? And I think conflict. And I think perhaps at the heart of the issue, it was imut. It was conflict for Rabbi Sacks, especially over the idea of relativism, which he sought not to that was an issue he didn't want to let go, and he succeeded. He succeeded in that, and he did, I believe, kind of in his life, or try to turn it into a and managed to turn it into a sikha, a conversation, which he would have, and which he was, very open to have and to learn from. So actually, his response to Enlightenment philosophy, whilst it comes as a innate critique of modernity, it's kind of unique thought in its own right. And I think also, our the ways in which we are currently building intellectual discussion around Rabbi Sacks through our conference and through books and articles. This is very much kind of, these are some of the issues that we're thinking about, because he seems to have kind of brought to the world his own category, in a sense. And this is also going to be important in the ways that we continue to form our conversations on the subject.
So this leads me to just a general observation about your writings on the subject, Dr. Feldman-Kay, which is that throughout your works you seem to be generally quite optimistic. You don't share some of the pessimism that many people have when talking about Judaism, postmodernism. You don't see it as necessarily a clash, but you see this as a fruitful field with inherent possibilities for dialogue and for discussion. Is this an apt characterization of your works? Are you fundamentally optimistic when you take a look at this field?
Firstly, I'll take it as a compliment.
Okay, fair enough. Not everyone would, but I'll okay.
Secondly, I think, just relating back to some of the challenges we discussed of biblical criticism of feminism, of other challenges there have been. I think it's important for there to be voices who are able to kind of say, these movements are not going away. People are already living these out. Are we going to turn away, or are we going to engage? If we're going to engage, are we going to reject or not? And if Rabbi Sacks said we have an obligation to be clear, I think I would say we have a moral obligation to be creative. And as the Jewish people, we haven't had the privilege to sit and not do theology. We have always been responding to the issues going on around us, and that's what we'll continue to do.
Yes, I will say amen to that. Finally, just before we go, I wanted to pose a final question. You mentioned, we as Jews don't have the luxury or to just sit and be uncreative. And I wanted to sort of broaden the question a little bit, which is that do you think that postmodernism has been antagonistic towards religions in general? I mean, has the assault on grand narratives undermined to the same degree, let's say, the Christian faith, the Islamic faith? Has there been an engagement within those faith traditions towards these ideas, or is there something different about Judaism, or does postmodernism strike Judaism in a unique fashion?
Okay, so this is also a great question. Instead of giving you a literature review, what I will say is that, I mean, certainly in contemporary Christian theology, and for the past few decades already, there have been quite serious and varied even responses to postmodernism. It's also a growing field in Islamic studies, and each really is experiencing, and that's just the monotheistic religion, each is experiencing postmodernism to different extents and different ways. Though what's important now, in my view, is to create an interreligious response where coping with postmodernism is not just redefining theology, everybody to their own, but actually it's an issue with engaging with the world ethically through a religious mindset. And if we are really going to take to heart some of the ideas of dialogue, the ethical thrust of the post World War era, then we need to be focused at the same time as doing theology on building a society of dialogue, something that should be an imperative in today's world. We need to cope and redefine, not alone, but together in this brave new world. And the practice of scriptural reasoning is perhaps the best example of how this is being done in today's world, where peoples of committed peoples from different religious traditions will come together and have textual learning sessions on issues of core interest, and we are kind of we spectate and also take part in the ways in which religious traditions themselves are coping with perhaps similar issues, but in very different ways. And I think that what's demanded of us today is a life of dialogue as much as we can. And I think that's also a position in terms of the thrust of looking at the ethical society and the life of dialogue. I think that's something that Rabbi Sachs found affinity with as well.
Fascinating. I never thought of that, I suppose, as postmodernism or postmodern ideas as a chance for interreligious dialogue and an opportunity in which to collaborate to a certain degree in engaging with this particular challenge. I think we could go for much longer. I think we should call time because we've been at this for a while. Dr. Feldman-Kay, I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you very much. This has been fascinating. And you say there are 3 more great topics or ideas in Jewish philosophy. So especially if you write 3 more books on the subject, we can have you, on after each time to discuss them. This has been a pleasure. Really, thank you very, very much.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
This has been the podcast of Jewish Idea, by Torah in Motion, produced by Alicia Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Alicia Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit torahinmotion.org/donate.